it's so powerful. I mean, this notion of continuity and change. What stops, what goes, what continues, and what finds its way to oblivion.
Yes.
I think episode 4 of this podcast, Family Secrets of the Spanish Civil War, speaks to that, because the centerpiece is this commemoration in New York City of the 50th anniversary of the war.
Yeah.
And so the struggle goes on, what to remember, what to forget.
But we're talking about a long, decades-long struggle to essentially win the war for memory. What was the war about? What were the forces arrayed? What was the outcome? And how are we still living with that outcome?
I think one of the really fun things about this and rich things about our conversations is this chase. We're in this chase with these relatives of ours, these historical figures, Jose Becerra and Joe Gordon, who cast such a long shadow in our families, as much by their absences, right, as by their presence, as by what we can document about them. So what I've loved about our conversations is that you've helped me sort of rethink what that absence might mean. And,
Okay.
I've been complaining, that my inability to find Jose's words in the documents, in the archives around Pueblo Nuevo, around this wonderful coal mining town. He was a government official, and he was, a very active agent in the community, and yet
Yes.
I can barely find it's almost nothing in his own voice. And, so that's one absence. And of course, the other absence that we've talked about is his second family, which literally kept him in divided time and on as a man, as a family man.
Why don't you talk a bit more about how he did business in your understanding? He was a prominent guy in the town. He was well known, a public figure, and yet you're not sure if he could write.
Exactly. I mean, I think that's what reviewing this yet again has really brought forward is like, he's a government official. He's kind of the neighborhood fixer, right? He has this home office where he helps people, and maybe some other kinds of deals are cut to make peace or to count the sides of various controversies in town. He never ran for office. He left no speeches, no editorials in the paper. He did his business. It was an oral culture, right?
Yes.
It's a neighborhood culture. And so it's not, in some ways, it's not surprising that maybe there's not that much, but no papers survive from this, either the city hall office or the home office, his despacho, that I have access to.
Business was done face to face.
Business was done face to face, exactly. And he did have a home office that had a big library of beautiful law books, because he was an autodidact. He was self-taught. I know he could read. I know he could sign his name, but I have no access to the ideas that may have shaped him politically or personally. His library was sold when he died in 1955, in part to meet the cash settlement that he had put in his will for this natural child, his daughter, that he had fathered outside of his.
Do we know anything about his parents?
Yes, I mean, his dad was a rural worker. He was a swineherd. He was a pig herder. And I think lived a long time, actually. Lived almost to the turn of the 20th century.
Well, he must. Jose must have also been something of an autodidact. I mean, even if he couldn't, read that well or write, somehow he got what he needed in terms of whether it was political views or just how to operate in town, how to be a politician. He may have had mentors that we don't know about.
That's
likely.
right. That's right. And I
so-
think the other people that I think he had around him to help, it has to do with this home office. And I know from family stories, because my mother's sister grew up in this house, that he had office workers, he had office help. at home. He had a secretary and clerks that cycled in and out of the office to typewrite. Of course, typewriting in the 30s and 40s was like a high skill job in Spain at the time. Of course, literacy rates are very, very high, especially in Andalusia. And even being a notary, being a notario, to be able to write documents out on official letterhead, these are real jobs, and there's just no widespread general literacy in Spain in my great grandfather's lifetime. So, it made me rethink why, his family reputation as a sort of brittle, hair trigger guy, a kind of very sensitive, very violent man, that he may have been functioning in a sense as a dependent on those who could handle written words and legal documents sort of better than he could, even though he was kind of a point person in the community. Yeah. So,
and of course, his
yeah.
his behavior at home may have been very different from his behavior in the office, right? I mean, you could be violent against your wife or your kids, but not necessarily with the people you work with.
Right. And although I think those things got very blurry. And of course, the quintessential story about the office and the bleeding between, this guy who carried the baston de mando, who carried the cane, right, that kept order in meetings, and he also was not, disinclined to use it outside of his official role. He ruled his family with a heavy hand, and I know this because of this sort of iconic family story that has come down about my grandmother. So Jose and Anna's firstborn child was my mother's mother, Carmen, and the idea, the story that has come down, it's a very broken story. It's like impossible to verify. So as an historian, it's kind of maddening. And it's also delicate as a family member because you're prying into some painful details of family life. But it seems like, best I've been able to piece together, that one of these young men who was working in Jose's home office seems to have gotten into a bit of a flirtation with my grandmother, Carmen. This would have been in the 1920s. And, I doubt that it got much beyond making eyes at one another, though I can't verify that. I mean, it's such a strict society. It's such a very highly regulated, I think Spaniards, Andalusians have a stereotype of being sort of fiery and passionate, which isn't untrue necessarily, but it's also very very rigid, very puritanical in some ways in its approach to sexuality, at least for women. And so the story goes that somehow my great grandfather got wind that that one of his secretaries, his male secretaries, and my grandmother were in some kind of flirtation, and he administered a horrible beating to my grandmother Carmen, not just a swat with his baston, right? Not just a whack. Not just a slap. You might want to think of these sort of gestures, a family, grand gestures of family violence, but this was a beating. This is a beating that inflicted injury on my grandmother. And the note that's always sounded, whoever tells the story, is about her having one of these heavy dining room chairs broken over her head. Well, this is a very, very serious beating, and my grandmother was injured, and she suffered some nerve damage to one of her eyes. And the rest of the denouement of the story is that my great grandfather felt contrite about this, particularly since Carmen did not heal very well after this beating, and she was taken, with great, fanfare, if you will, on a long car ride to Barcelona to see a special doctor to see if she could be, put back together. And and this was not successful. And it was an injury that my grandmother carried her whole life. And it's a broken story. It's not something I ever talked about, certainly not with my grandmother. I only met her once when I was a very small child, and it's not something I really wanted to pry into so deeply. But the way it's kind of come up in my own life is that my mother, my grandmother Carmen's firstborn, was, somewhat ironically, very born with a lazy eye. Yeah. And so the way we have made sense of this, of course, anyone can be born with a lazy eye, but in my mind, it's a kind of ghostly echo, if you will, of this terrible injury inflicted on her mother
Boy, listening to the description of the beating makes me feel like there's probably more than a flirtation of eyes there. I mean, maybe
so.
he questioned, in flagrante or something. I mean, who knows?
Maybe so,
But
and I think the severity too might have been that this young man might have been one of Jose's other natural children. We don't know, but that's also part of this broken story. That in fact, part of why he was so incensed and why this had to be so emphatically put down was that it might have been his half son.
he didn't beat
Um,
him up, though, did he?
nope, nope.
Well,
Yeah, women are both object and subject of the sexual double standard.
yes.
And so it's never been resolved. I know there were 3 servant women in that household for at least my aunt's entire growing up of 10, 12 years there. And so it could have been a half sibling of my grandmother's, which would have made it another kind of crisis, right? Not just a crisis of his authority in the household, but a kind of deeper moral crisis that would
Yeah,
have been very hard to
no
navigate.
doubt.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so it's been hard to put much back together, but I think thinking about what even was possible in terms of his literacy, the terms that why his office was sort of taken apart, right, upon his death rather than preserved. There's all these
Yeah,
factors that the personal and political are so intertwined.
that's certainly true.
As
True
as
everywhere.
as for you, yeah, as for you and your these amazing
Well,
relatives, these
yeah,
these restless souls that you are the
yes.
heir to.
Uh, yeah, I mean, I'm listening to you, and it reminds me that I mean, something I always tell my students, that history is an active imagination, and that whether you're reading history, whether you're researching it, whether you're writing it, certainly, the best history has to have imagination behind it, and part of that means that, when the evidence is not there, when you really can't figure out what happened, um, trying to make the best imaginative case is something that historians do all the time, and this is what you've done here with your great grandfather. And it's also the case that memory memories play tricks on people. A story involving one of my relatives in Spain, which really brings us to the fore, and also confronted me with a painful choice between the facts I knew and stories that my relatives were telling me. And so, in brief, in 1986, which was the 50th anniversary of the beginning of the Spanish Civil War, there was a very, very big celebration at Felt Forum in Madison Square Garden, scripted by Ring Lardner Jr. and a lot of luminaries were there, actors,
Wow.
singers, musicians. There were thousands of people who went, and it was a big deal. And shortly after that, a couple of months later, the Village Voice, which at that time, I'm talking about 1986, was sort of the premier newspaper of the left liberal part of New York, and they published an article, was an interview with a Spanish Civil War vet named William Herrick. The interview was done by Paul Berman, one of their staff writers. And it really got all the surviving vets incredibly angry because for their one article, their one piece about the Spanish Civil War and its 50th anniversary, the Voice chose to essentially feature a guy who had been a veteran but had later broken with the veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, and he had broke with the Communist Party, as many vets did who had been in the party.
Right.
But unlike them, William Herrick went on to testify before the Subversive Activities Control Board in the 50s. He named names, claimed that the veterans, that the Lincoln Brigade was basically a appendage of the Communist Party. And the fact that he informed on people really enraged folks. He also wrote several novels. And in the Village Voice article that I'm referring to, the one that ticked off so many people, among other claims, William Herrick made the assertion that the commander of the Lincoln Battalion at the Battle of Brunete, a man named Oliver Law, who was African American, activist from Chicago. Oliver Law was the first African American to ever command mixed white and black troops in American history.
Yeah, amazing.
At any rate, he was commander only briefly because he was killed during the Battle of Brunete. And in this interview, William Herrick repeated a story that he had told in some of his novels and in other places to the effect that Oliver Law was killed by his own men, what we would call fragged today,
Ugh.
and that he had been shot by several of his own men because they were angry at his incompetence, and that after they shot him, they danced around his body, his corpse, let it sort of decompose in the sun, and then urinated on the corpse, pissed on him,
Ugh.
literally.
Ugh.
And there was a tremendous outrage about this, and there had been other people, including another vet named Harry Fisher, who was right there at the time, who said, this did not happen. And Herrick claims he heard it from other vets at some drunken party that he was not present at. At any rate, where my family comes into this is that one of the people he named as one of the people who killed Oliver Law was my cousin Joe Gordon, Joseph Menglowitz.
Ugh.
And in the aftermath of this article, a bunch of the vets got together and picketed the Village Voice to express their outrage, and they had signs saying, among other things, "Berman is vermin," referring to Paul Berman. And there was a heated exchange of letters. And how I got involved in this is simply this, that in the exchange of letters, one of the people who wrote into the Village Voice was Joe Gordon's sister, Rose Smorodin. She had married Abe Smorodin, another Spanish Civil War vet. And in her letter to the Voice, and this was supported by many of the vets, she made the claim that Joe Gordon was not even at Brunete. So how could he be involved with this? And they
Got
were
it.
very upset about it. I spoke to Paul Berman on the phone after this. I knew him from New York a bit. And my own research into Joe Gordon's life and into the records I saw of the battalion and some other sources showed that he clearly was at Brunete. In fact, he had
Wow.
been wounded in the thigh there.
Wow.
And I had an exchange of letters with Rose's husband Abe about this, and it was painful because I felt that Rose, by telling that story and publishing this letter, had given ammunition basically to Herrick and to Paul Berman to the effect that, well, see, they're lying about this, and so you
Oh
can't trust them.
no. Right.
And so this is the case where I had to choose between the facts that I knew and what I was hearing from my family. Abe Smorodin said to me, "Well, the real issue was not who was at Brunete and who wasn't at Brunete, because 50 years memories are fade and so on." He said the real question was this assertion that Joe Gordon somehow had killed his commanding officer and then defiled his body. And
Ugh.
subsequent research, convinces me that Herrick is wrong, that the story was made up, that other eyewitnesses, he was not an eyewitnesses had essentially refuted this.
Yeah.
But the fact that they had not been truthful about Joe being at Brunete, or else they had forgotten, or whatever it was, just complicated this thing.
Ugh.
And I also had an exchange of letters with William Herrick, who was a good friend of Joe Gordon's in Spain.
Wow.
But and in fact, in his novel Hermanos, his best-known novel, the main character, Joe Garms, is pretty much based on Joe Gordon. So,
Oh my word. Wow.
so there's all this sort of stuff about stories that are told, what actually happened, novels that are written, stories that continue to circulate. And I was sort of in the middle of it.
Wow.
And the fact that my cousin Rose and her husband Abe were wrong about Brunete, there's in no way sort of support this wild story that Herrick told and continued to tell. And so this caused a tremendous amount of anger and sort of grief. And as I said, there was this public protest, but I think it is unfortunate, to be honest, that the Voice chose this one guy and this one interview to be their sort of treatment for the 50th anniversary of the
My
Spanish
God. It's devastating because, you know, every family member has their own memory and their own sense of what's true about their loved one. And, we can't, even though we're historians, we can't expect our loved ones to call us up every time they want to check their memory and, write a letter to the editor. Of course, people aren't really writing letters to the editor anymore, but so you can't really blame Aunt Rose for defending what she felt to be true. And yet,
Yeah.
and even your research, I also want to know when and where you found this document that placed him, because that's part Of course, I'm on the edge of my seat. Like, where did you find this? But even if you found that he was there, it's a little bit inconclusive, right? You can't, your document doesn't exactly exonerate him. It doesn't incriminate him either,
No,
so that's really frustrating that we can't come through 100%. We can just sort of add what little
no,
we know. And that's so frustrating. Tell the
right.
story
No,
of how
I
you
was
found
not,
this
you're
document.
right. I was not trying to exonerate him. I had seen references to his being wounded at Brunete in several places. Number one was in the Russian archives, where each of the soldiers had to fill out a kind of record of where they were from, when they got to Spain, what engagements they were in. And Joe Gordon himself says, he was wounded at Jarama, and then he was
Wow.
wounded at Brunete. I also
Wow.
found references to him in the Volunteer, the sort of self-published a little newspaper that the vets had started in the trenches in 1937. And I have a picture of him too, with three other guys, and he's got a cane. You can see that he's walking with a cane because of the
Wow.
shrapnel wound in his leg. So there's
Wow.
no doubt in my mind he was there. There's also no doubt in my mind that Herrick was a fabulist, and that
Right.
this whole story had been concocted. And I mean, I do have at least one or two references from historians who really dug deeper into this thing than I ever did, and they concluded that same thing, that there's nothing to this story, that it was something that circulated for years. Yeah, there's a version of this story that appeared in the novelist Bernard Wolfe's 1959 novel called The Great Prince is Dead,
Hmm.
in which Oliver Law became Sheridan Justice. In Herrick's
Wow.
version, he was Cromwell Webster, clearly a play on his name, Oliver Law. And so, but as I said, these reports have been pretty much debunked
Yeah.
by the
Well,
most serious historians that I've read.
yeah. I mean, the character Oliver Law sounds too. He's irresistible.
Yeah,
It's an irresistible character, and so
yeah.
unfortunately, people have galloped off in different directions with this. What's the time frame between the? Sounds like you were in the middle of the newspaper exchanges. Did you ever go back to Gussie to Rose pardon me, with what you found?
Yeah, I did. In fact, I had some correspondence with Abe, her husband, who was for a long time National Secretary of VALB, Veterans of the Lincoln Brigade, and was a vet himself. And, he acknowledged that, well, maybe they were wrong about Brunete, but he felt that the real issue was this canard that
Yeah.
somehow these guys had killed Oliver Law.
Yeah.
And, there's another issue too. I mean, Law was African American, and the question was, did the Communist Party want him to be the commander because they wanted to promote a black, and that was a big thing with the party in the 30s.
Yes,
There were
absolutely.
other African Americans in the battalion who might have been better than Law.
Huh.
Law apparently had served in the army for some years, and people with army experience were very few and far between. So there
Right.
was some thinking that, well, they promoted the wrong black, they promoted the
Ugh.
wrong African American.
Ay, ay,
But
ay.
these people are all dead now, and there's no way we're ever going to finally resolve it, except to say that again, any historian knows that you never get all the facts, you never have all the evidence, you never
Right.
have all the sources, so you have to make do with what you
Yeah.
got. And having said that, I'm confident that the story is, as I say, a fantasy,
Wow.
and it got caught up in some of the very, very bitter political quarrels that followed Spain. I mean, Bernard Wolfe, the novelist, had been a communist, and then he became a Trotskyist. And as I said, William Herrick had been in the Communist Party, was wounded at Jarama, but afterwards broke with the party, broke with the veterans of the Lincoln Brigade, and wound up testifying and informing against them in the
God.
1950s. So you
God.
can't really separate these kinds of political differences from what people claimed happened, what they remembered.
What did Berman have to say? I mean, I just admire your bravery to really confront. You're a brand new assistant professor in 1986 or so, right? You're practically a
Yeah,
grad
well,
student. And
it,
how did that go?
it had no impact on me at Mount Holyoke, certainly. I had just joined the board of ALBA at this time. This is like my
Okay.
first big sort of controversy. I knew Paul Berman from New York a bit. He's a talented writer. but also his politics are deeply anti-communist, and he fancied himself something of an anarchist. And so it's not surprising to me that he wanted to glorify a guy like Herrick, who was also a bitter anti-communist,
Right.
and sort of follow that line. And unfortunately, Paul Berman, I think that he's blinded in some sense by his own
Yeah.
anti-communist. Because it's like
Yeah.
you can't believe anything they say. And so when one of the people who wrote into The Voice, a guy named Harry Fisher, who was also a Lincoln Battalion guy and who was an eyewitness to Oliver Law's death, when
My
he wrote a
God.
letter protesting this, Berman's response was to say, well, Harry Fisher was a communist for a long time, and for a while he worked for the TASS news agency, and we can't believe anything he says. And that's unfortunate. I
Wow.
think that you dismiss somebody's account simply because you think that they lie about everything. And so, Berman can defend himself. He's a well-known writer. He was a MacArthur genius guy. But he had an axe to grind when it came to Spain.
Yeah.
And like other people, Ronald Radosh comes to mind. This notion that somehow the Soviet Union was instrumental in creating the international brigades, which it was, and the fact that many of the men in the Lincoln Battalion were communists, which they were, somehow it means that we can simply dispose of anything they've ever said,
Yeah.
that we can
Right.
simply dismiss them. And of course, there were many and many of them that broke with the party. Most famously, Steve Nelson, who had been the commissar, and later on was the head of the VALB, has his own autobiography, which is quite good. Steve Nelson, American Radical. Actually, it's a biography, but he was involved with it. At any rate, I'm
No, I
going.
think this is so rich because I think we have, in everyday discourse today, we have this sort of kind of simplistic understanding of people's political affiliations that everyday discourse in the US is sort of like it's more about parties. Whereas there were movements, right? The
Yes.
time period where there's movements and there's a certain amount of fluidity and there's a certain amount of
Yes.
fellow traveler. It's like not everything is this sort of black and white. I belong to this. And funnily enough, my son and I watched Oppenheimer, and the first political gesture in that movie is the Oppenheimer is supporting the Republican, organizing chemists, right? Organizing physicists to support the resistance to fascism in Spain. And there's a couple of scenes, of course, in that movie where these malintentioned opportunistic politicians in Washington are trying to pin people's affiliations down in ways that just don't make sense, right? It is not the way
Guilt by
people live their
associ-
politics.
guilt by association.
Yeah, and it doesn't really speak to how they join social movements and the relationship between movement behavior and partisan behavior. It just broad brushes
And
everything.
also, in terms of Oppenheimer, just to follow up this point, that Oppenheimer, his second wife was the widow of a Spanish Civil War casualty, a guy named Joe Dallet, who was well known among the Americans. So I think that the movie sort of underplays Oppenheimer's politics for various reasons. Larger point to make is that there's been no more ideologically driven war, certainly in the 20th century, than the Spanish Civil War. And so ideology is always there, but people
Absolutely.
change. The example I like to point to, for many people, the only thing they know about the Spanish Civil War, the only book they might have read, the only reference they have is George Orwell.
Yep.
Who, Homage to Catalonia, recounts, among other things, his brief experience in Barcelona, his involvement with the POUM, the anarchist group. And in the book, the basic argument that Orwell makes is that the anarchists were interested in making a social revolution. That was their goal, and they were basically crushed by the communists who didn't want to pursue social revolution while the war was being fought. Okay, this becomes a kind of celebration. In fact, Paul Berman calls William Herrick our American Orwell, just to make that connection.
Wow.
Well, in 1943, in the midst of World War II, Orwell changes his tune. And Orwell talks about how it's impossible to have a social revolution when you're trying to win a war. At that point, it was Britain. And what Orwell is basically saying is that, forget about revolution. You got to win the war first. You have
Yeah.
to mobilize the populace, the industry, and so on. But nobody ever talks about that side of Orwell.
Right. Right. They
So
keep them frozen in time in the
that's
cafes in
right.
Barcelona.
That's
Exactly.
right.
Exactly. I mean, the whole thing about, where were you during the war? I mean, has been a driver for me in this book. And, I came up with very little, but I certainly was able to find out a few things that counter the family story, which is the family story about Jose Becerras. He was not in Pueblo Nuevo from 1936 to 39, that he was absented. He was somehow absented from sides of this conflict. And there's just a hole, there's just a blank for the war. There's no war stories in my family, in my Spanish family history that are told. No war stories. But I didn't. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Go ahead, finish your thought, and then I'll
Yeah, I
jump in.
mean, and this whole thing around sort of finger pointing and what does it look like on the ground, and retribution and recriminations, that stuff you hope you can find, but you imagine you find it in family stories. It's not in mine.
Mhm.
But I didn't give up. I mean, one thing I learned was that because this mining town was such a desirable war objective for both sides,
Right.
and because, in fact, this part of Córdoba province was loyal to the Republic, it was the site of, a lot of struggle. And the fascists got in there early in the fall, October 14th, 1936. They fly in with airplanes. They want this place badly. And they are successful in large part because those who had mobilized locally were quickly deployed elsewhere because they felt that the town was relatively safe because it was loyal. The mayor of Pueblo Nuevo becomes the interim civil governor of the province, so they figure their backs are covered, right? Well, turns out not so much. And as soon as the nationalists enter the village, they start asserting, engineering regime change. And, the first thing they do is start to, quote unquote, purify the schools. So there's a whole kind of political, ideological litmus test for school teachers, and they have to sort of sign away, I'm not political, I'm not on any side. And, there's a kind of pro forma feeling to some of this that you kind of wonder about, but that's all you have. You have these tiny little files with the school teacher's name and testimony, and three people line up and say, no, this person was not on any side. Right. And by 1939, right, because this last ditch effort by local resistance fighters to take back the mining villages, at the Battle of what becomes the Battle of Valsequillo in January 1939. Things are hot. Things are hot in Pueblo Nuevo once the war actually ends. It's kind of an inconclusive, bloody but inconclusive battle. But people are highly mobilized, and there's been there's been killing, there's been people thrown in various jails. And so what I did find, because my great grandfather was a civil servant, he was not a military person, and most of what happens in terms of sorting out the sides is under the aegis of the military. So I went to Sevilla to look at records for what was called the Second Military Tribunal, the sort of military court that was in charge of sorting out bodies, right, at the end of the war, who's in what jail, who is owning what property, who has to be tried under the laws of political responsibility, this sort of thing. And I found, true to my impression, was that the village had been relatively quiet as opposed to other places. I only found 3 files of anything kind of going down in 1939, really in the very immediate post-war period, this literally May, right? April and May of 1939. And I found 3 cases. And in one of those, my great-grandfather makes an appearance. In the first case, is one of a guy who had tried to retake Hinojosa del Duque, which is a little mining town near Pueblo Nuevo. And he was a very committed Rojo, as his file reads. They're very biased, right? File folders. He's a committed Rojo, he's a committed Marxist, and he tried to, engage with the nationalists, but got taken prisoner of war. And he's found guilty again of atrocities, supposedly, and does a long jail sentence. And there's a file on this guy who's from Pueblo Nuevo, he's a miner, and he goes to jail until the 60s. And so it's a long and, punitive sentence. I found another case of two families that had farms just outside Pueblo Nuevo, but all these file folders are marked Pueblo Nuevo. So clearly it's a base for doing some of this sorting work, some of this finger pointing, lining up who was on what side and what's going to happen. So these two families that live nearby, one just to the north and one just to the south, are accused of harboring some of these guerrillas who were intending to fight the nationalists and get them out of the neighborhood. And these two families are kind of rounded up, and there's long testimony taken, and they are accused with harboring rebels or harboring Republican rojos, so to speak. And they say, yes, this happened, but we were forced to. So we fed them. Yes, we stored their weapons, and we even accepted payment for this service, but we didn't really have a choice. It was sort of at gunpoint, but the people doing the investigating were having none of it. And they even gave names. These families, even presumably to protect their farm, gave names and identified people who they said, so-and-so. You can ask them yourself, go find them yourself. You can, see that what we say is true. Again, the tribunal's having none of it, so they go off to prison. It's not clear what happens to their property, but then their file is reopened in 1947, and these two families name a whole nother set of names as putting the pressure on them. And I imagine they were under some pressure, right? They were looking for more people. Yeah. I mean, I have to wonder, right? They were probably looking for more names and decided to entice these people to name more names with the idea that they would have a reduced sentence. And they certainly did name different names, and they did get a reduced sentence. So there's more to say there. I'm not really a historian of the post-guerra, but just, again, very interesting pressure on everyday people.
And I think that pressure on, I think that your description of the memory in your family, the kitchen table history, around the stuff in your family, may reflect, or maybe another version of a reality of almost every war that I've ever studied, which is that, a lot of people don't want any part of it. And even though the Spanish Civil War was, as I said before, probably the most ideologically driven conflict in the 20th century, maybe in any century, there's no doubt in my mind that there are many people that wanted no part of either side, particularly in the rural areas. I think of the American Revolution, for example, where it's clear that the majority of people did not support the patriot cause. We know, for example, too, that in the Civil War, there were people who fought on both sides, depending on who was winning in what neighborhood. Sign up for 6 months, get a bonus. Don't like that? Sign up the other side for 6 months, get a bonus, or 3 months, whatever it might be. So even in Spain, in the Spanish Civil War, I think that there were probably a lot of people for whom it was just about survival. And, the silences that you sort of, report or that you encountered, maybe an extension of that.
No, I think that's really well taken, a point really well taken that doesn't often get into the history books, much less the nightly news version of history that most people get. And the payoff for me in going to these files was I actually did find where my great-grandfather's voice, I did find his voice. I did find two testimonies he gave on behalf of this third character from the village who's brought before the tribunal. And his testimony really speaks to your sense of people's ambivalence, the kind of finger in the wind of survival in these really charged and lethal circumstances. And this third guy who is, he's sort of hauled out of prison from Valencia. He was taken prisoner around Madrid at a Battle of Teruel, where he was fighting on the Republican side. and he gets taken prisoner of war in Valencia, and then he's in the hospital, and somehow his file has emerged because someone back in Pueblo Nuevo wants this guy's head. His name is Manzano. And apparently, before Manzano was deployed out of Pueblo Nuevo, he's born there. He did a little time as he had a little sort of political position in the village and put somebody's brother in jail for ser fascista, for being a fascist. And after the war, this guy's family wants him to pay and wants him put away for a long time. But this guy decides to put up a fight. And he says in this file, he brings some testimony forward, and he has calls on some people from Pueblo Nuevo to testify for him, including my great-grandfather. And he says, look, I was a civil servant. I worked for the city of Pueblo Nuevo. I'm a butcher by trade. I was a member of the Employees Association. So there's not really a civil service in Spain, but it's kind of like, a municipal union for civil servants, if you will. And he's like, and by the way, I didn't sign up for the Republican cause. We had a socialist government. We had a socialist city hall, which is absolutely true. And they impressed me into the army. And not only was I an unwilling combatant, I'm a butcher by trade. I was a cook. I'm not an ideologue. I'm not a revolutionary. I am being unjustly held. I should be released. And here's my colleagues from Pueblo Nuevo are going to testify. And my great-grandfather says, yes, he was a member of the employee union, the employee association, and he testifies to Manzano's good conduct. Well, literally days later, as the other side mobilizes against this guy, Antonio Manzano, the wind is shifting against him, and the Falange appointee, the new mayor of Pueblo Nuevo, says, oh no, Manzano was I want to get this right. I have the word right here. He was a member of the Radical Party, a dedicated Marxist with a pistol at his side. So in other words, this is a guy who's strutting around armed and dangerous.
I get it.
And, he also enabled and embedded other people to sort of join the Filas Rojas, the red rank and file. And in fact, he even wore the wrong hat. He wore the gorra of the radical cause. And so they know he was a very political guy and very much a rebel. Anyway, so once my great-grandfather sees that it's stacking up against him at City Hall, he comes back and says, oh, well, yeah, Manzano, he was a butcher. He worked in the slaughterhouse, which was a plum contract for the city. But yeah, in fact, he quit the Employees Association to become what he's called a very enthusiastic, muy entusiastico socialist. And, and I can sort of doesn't totally throw him under the bus, and he could have said much worse about him, but it's clear he had his finger in the wind, and this guy went to jail and didn't even get a second hearing till well into the 1950s, and did a long jail sentence. And that's what finger pointing looked like in Pueblo Nuevo. And my family has no memory of, there's just a blank. And this is this is April and May of 1939. So the guns are still, everything's still hot.
Well,
but it paid off to go to the archives. It was really good to find, because it fills in what little we had.
Listening to the story of Manzano, is that the name? I couldn't help thinking that, well, if he survived the Battle of Teruel, how bad could it be to be dealing with these petty bureaucrats and in these judicial and legal proceedings? I know about the Battle of Teruel because my cousin Leo, Joe's brother, was there and was badly wounded there. But he recovered and became promoted to a lieutenant, being head of the machine gun company. And he was there in December, around Christmas of 1937, when Paul Robeson, the great American singer, came to sing to the Republican.
I forgot that.
Teruel,
I forgot that. Amazing.
In 2 feet of snow, apparently. And of course, as you know, Teruel was a terrible battle, and the Republicans thought they had won, and then there was a big fascist counterattack. And so that was, one of the really hellish battles. And so if this guy survived and was wounded at Teruel, no matter what his politics were, I'm thinking, what's the big deal about dealing with this other stuff? Because, he got through
Fair,
a
fair
lot.
enough. He's tough as nails, and he's a young guy. He's 29 when he comes to four. He's still got his whole life in front of him. So it's a fight worth making. You
Yeah.
know,
Well, all of these people are mostly in their 20s. And, it's one of the
I
tragic aspects of the whole thing.
I forgot
Young lives
about
cut short.
Robeson.
Oh,
Gosh,
yeah. That was a big deal.
that's
Uh,
amazing. I'm a peak skill girl, so I have a very, tender spot for Robeson. He almost lost his life in my hometown.
well, that's a big part of this chapter I wrote about what happens after World War II. I have a whole account of the Peekskill thing that I'll send it to you if I haven't sent
Oh,
that to you.
really? I haven't read
Yes,
that yet.
I'll
Wow.
send it to you. Yeah, my dad was there. My both my parents, several uncles, and
Oh my
as you know,
gosh.
Robeson, the first concert, he had sang there, by the way, several summers in a row. In 1949, the political atmosphere had gotten really, the Cold War had really was in full force, and
Right.
it was right after Robeson had made these comments that were misinterpreted by the Associated Press about how no American Negro would ever fight against Russia, and also the American Communist Party leadership was on trial at that time in New York City under the Smith Act. There were 11 top leaders of the CP. So it was a very, very
Hot.
difficult time.
Yeah.
But there's no question that when you read the accounts of the first concert, which was canceled, there was a tremendous amount of racism and anti-Semitism in play. And of course,
Yep.
a large fraction of the people who were going to come were Jews, and there were a lot of blacks actually as well. At any rate, after the cancellation of that first concert, the next week they rescheduled it, and there
Right.
were about 20,000 people that showed up. And to protect Robeson, they created a sort of a security line of about 2,000 men, most of whom were Army vets, including my dad and a couple of my uncles, who basically
Wow.
formed a chain around the concert grounds to protect Robeson, and the concert went on. But I refer maybe too cheekily to that whole thing as the Altamont of the old left.
Wow.
It was a concert that in some ways signaled the end of the influence that the left had throughout the 30s and the 40s. I'll send that to you. Yeah.
I'd love
Uh,
to see it. It's completely erased in peak skill history. The Italian and Irish descended immigrants who've run the Democratic Party, since before, I
There
can
was a big
remember.
KKK center there too.
No doubt, but the way they've repackaged that waterfront is that it's a stop on the
Oh, now you mean? Oh, yeah.
on the underground. Right, yeah. Right now, Robeson is
Right.
completely erased, and now there's a few of the old Wasp families. One of the not the Van Courts, they're nearby. Depew, the Depew family is sort of
Right.
resurrected as this abolitionist family, and Peekskill's a stop on the Underground Railroad. So the post-war 20th
Right.
century stuff is completely erased.
Barbara Koppel, the great documentary filmmaker, was going to make a film about Peekskill. She never did. But I know there's a collection of her papers at Cabinet Library at NYU, all related to what she did. She did a lot of interviews, research, and so on.
Oh, I'd love
I
to see
have
that.
some other sources that I dug up. And, you know, uh, it's also a great newsreel, little chunk of newsreel that you could find on YouTube that sort of goes through Peekskill and the guys intoning over which Peekskill, like peaceful community on the Hudson, which was
Right.
and as they're going through the town, you can see this big sign, Stanley Tucci Vegetables and Produce, and it was
Right.
Stanley Tucci's father, the actor. So he
That's
also
right.
grew up in Peekskill.
That's right. That's
And I
right.
thought, well, look at that. And so there's a lot, but the real thing too was that there was a tremendous amount of resentment, as you probably know, in Peekskill against all of these left-wing bungalow colonies that had, grown up around that area in
So this
Westchester.
red diaper baby land, that was all the summer camps.
Well, the Goldensbridge colony, which two of my aunts, Gussie and Torma, had houses in, was not far away, and there was a whole bunch of people that went from Goldensbridge to Peekskill. My uncle Tommy had a truck, and he's written up in some of his accounts as sort of like getting people away from the rioters, and I mean it's really
Wow.
it's a really very sad story. But
Yeah.
I grew up hearing about this stuff. Peekskill was a kind of, it was referred to all the time. It was a deeply affecting event. And
Yeah.
my mother used to say there was the smell of fascism in the air,
Ugh.
because especially because of all the anti-Semitism and the racism. But
Oh, that's so distressing. Yeah, there is an old
even
Jewish
as you grew up,
cemetery. Yeah, there's an old Jewish cemetery that a segregate, an old school Jewish cemetery. So there's been a long-standing Jewish community, small in
yeah,
Peekskill, but but I
those weren't the
experienced
Jews they were worried about, though. They were worried about people like my family.
yeah, the right, not
Right,
our Jews, as David
yeah,
Mamet would say, they're not our Jews.
yeah,
And when I grew up there, it was just extremely Catholic and just
yeah.
very dominated by Irish and Italian, third, fourth generation, big family, big families, and
Yeah. The other thing that Peekskill, I think, we're on a tangent here, but that's okay. The other thing that Peekskill, I think, really embodied was, it was kind of shocking to me. I mean, I sort of knew about this, but this incredibly rapid change in American political culture and the American political atmosphere, where during World War II, and I have this in my letters that my dad wrote from North Africa and Italy when he was overseas in the army. Um, you know, Communists and other people on the left were absolutely convinced, they was certain that once the war was over, they were going to continue to play a big role in the New Deal,
hmm,
the cultural front in Hollywood,
hmm,
the labor movement, certainly, neighborhood organizations. And of course, the US and the USSR were allied.
right.
And Earl Browder, at the time, the head of the Communist Party in 1944-45, was talking about the importance of post-war, unity would continue between Russia and the United States. In 1944, no group did more to re-elect FDR for the fourth time than the Communist Party. And this is something I didn't really
Wow,
know.
wow, it's a good
And then
reminder. Wow.
everything changed very quickly. And so, the Popular Front dissolves, anti-communism, roars back with a vengeance. Of course, it had always been there in American life, certainly since the late 19th century. And all of
It's
these people,
very opportunistic. It strikes me, very opportunistic.
oh yeah, it really wasn't about communism so much. The
Yeah,
Cold War was,
exactly. It was about jockeying for political power.
and also about rolling back the New Deal.
Yeah.
And I mean, the Republicans are still, engaged in that. And for
Right.
70, 80 years later, it's all about rolling back the New Deal and rolling back the idea that government has a responsibility to improve the lives of citizens.